this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll explain how to count rows in your knitted fabric. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. How do I count rows sounds like a simple question that should have a simple answer, but the answer can be different depending on the situation. Are you trying to figure out how many rows you've worked in your pattern since you cast on? Are you trying to figure out how many rows you have worked since you switched from one stitch pattern to another? Or from one color to another? Or maybe you're trying to figure out how to match an existing piece of knitting row for row, such as when you are knitting the second sleeve or the second sock. Today, I will walk you through several scenarios to help you count rows at each stage of the knitting process. So let's get started. So these are 4 swatches where I cast on 10 stitches. I knit back and forth in Knit 1 Purl 1 ribbing. I went back and forth across all of the stitches 10 times, and then I bound off across all of the stitches. So on the 11th trip across the needle, I bound the stitches off, and I bound off still in pattern. So I still did the Knit 1 Purl 1 as I bound off. So let's take a look at how many rows of knitting I actually have in the finished swatches. So when we count rows in a finished item, we don't count the cast on edge or the bind off edge. So we look only for rows that are actually of finished knitting. So we can look for the famous V's. This is Knit 1 Purl 1 ribbing, so they're kind of spread apart, but you can kind of see how we've got these V's, the stitches that are the V's. And the bottom V that we have is this one right here. What's below it is not lined up with it, it's separate, it creates this little edge. So let's count how many rows we have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I have 10 rows here, and then across the top we can see the bind off chain. So we don't count the bind off chain and we don't count the cast on edge. So we have 10 rows of stitches here. So swatch number 2, let's count how many rows I have in this one. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 11 rows this time. Here's another swatch. In this swatch, I used what's called an E-wrap or backwards loop or simple cast on. I just created twisted loops on the needle, and then I knit across them. So what do I have? So this bottom bit here is a twisted loop. It's not an actual stitch and not a row of stitches. It's the edge. We're not counting the edge. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Once again, we have 10. Now here is another swatch. This one I used the long tail cast on. This one is related to the E-wrap cast on. Every time you make one of those twisted loops, you immediately knit it. So let's count how many we have here. We can see there's a little bump here. That's the edge. We're not going to count that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So sometimes when we work in Knit 1 Purl 1 for 10 rows and then we bind off on the 11th row, sometimes we end up with 10 rows of ribbing and sometimes we end up with 11. So knitters often ask if the long tail cast on, should they count that as row 1 because they've heard the long tail cast on adds a row of knitting? And the answer to that is probably not, because as we've seen, the long tail cast on is not the only cast on method in which you can end up with an extra row of knitting compared to other cast on methods. I would actually say it's more true that the E-wrap cast on and knitting on actually results in fewer rows, but it really depends on what your perspective is. So here we have a swatch where we've got Knit 1 Purl 1 ribbing, and we've got a span of stockinette, and then we have seed stitch. So here we've got one stitch pattern right above the cast on edge. We've got another span of stitches that's in the middle, and then we have a span of rows worked in a stitch pattern right before we bind off. So first let's figure out how we count how many rows we have in our finished swatch. of each of the different stitch patterns. So if we want to duplicate something, we need to know what's already there. So we're looking at this edge. We don't want to count the edge itself. We want to count how many rows of ribbing we have. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now it looks like we've got 7 right here. It looks like this is a 7th row, but we can confirm whether that's actually true by comparing it to the purl bump next to it. So this purl bump here is the head of a stitch. This stitch right here, the head is in back of it, and that's on the same row as this one. So this purl bump shows that this is actually the last row of ribbing here. So we have 6 rows of ribbing, and you can confirm that by comparing the stitch above this purl bump. Right here, you can see that this is a regular knit stitch, and this one is in line with this one. This one looks enlarged because it's connected to the ribbing, and so it can fool you, but we actually have 6 rows of ribbing here. Now let's look at how many rows of stockinette we have. So this is a good column because we have these purl bumps. We have a purl bump ending the ribbing here, and we have a purl bump starting the seed stitch here. So we've got this one that's kind of buried under here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 6 rows of stockinette. And now we're going to look at the seed stitch. So we can count the bumps. We can count in a diagonal. We can kind of count back and forth like this because these purl bumps are offset from each other. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see this right under the edge, the 6th one, but you also know that this one is here because you can see that there's an actual full knit stitch above it. So we've got 6 rows of seed stitch here. We've got 6 rows of ribbing, 6 rows of stockinette, and 6 rows of seed stitch. So let's duplicate that. So we're going to cast on 10 stitches because that's what we had before. You can use any cast on method you want. Okay, so I have 10 stitches. We want 6 rows of ribbing. So I'm going to work 6 rows of ribbing and then see what I actually have. Okay, so I have worked back and forth 6 times. So let's count up how many rows of knitting I actually have below the needles. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now I use the long tail cast on. So the number of rows I work across is the number of rows I will actually get below the needles in whatever stitch pattern I was working. Knitting on or a simple E-wrap cast on, at this point I would have 5 rows of ribbing below my needle, and I need 6 rows of ribbing below my needle, so I would need to work 1 more row. Even though I had been counting along 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if I were using one of those 2 cast on methods, I would need another row if what I'm trying to do is match something that I know has 6 rows of actual ribbing. The loops that are on the needle are not knits or purl stitches. Only the stitches below the needle have become knits or purls. So however I work my next row is what those stitches are going to become. So if I work them in stockinette, if I work all of these stitches as knits, then when these stitches come off the needle, they will become knit stitches. If I work all of these stitches as purls, then when they come off the needle, they will be purls. So I know that I need to work 6 rows of stockinette. Stockinette is knit on the right side, purl on the wrong side. The long tail cast on, which is what I used, one side of the cast on has these bumps at the bottom, and the other side of the cast on is smooth. Now I prefer the smooth side of the long tail cast on. Not everybody does, but I do. So for me, I want the smooth side to be facing out to the public. I want the smooth side to be the right side of the fabric. That means if I'm going to be working across, I want this then to be the wrong side of the row. So when I start working in stockinette, I'm going to want to work a wrong side row in order to make this a wrong side row. So at this point, I have my 6 rows of ribbing and I have 6 rows of stockinette. So now I need to switch to seed stitch, and I need to have a total of 6 rows of seed stitch between my stockinette and my bind off edge. I'm going to work 5 rows of seed stitch before I bind off. Okay, so at this point I have 5 rows of seed stitch. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can count all those purl bumps in that diagonal and verify I have 5. The reason I wanted to stop here is because as I mentioned before, whenever you work across a row of stitches, whatever the stitches that are currently on the needle will become whatever stitch pattern you work as you're working across this time. So when you bind off, you're typically instructed to bind off in pattern because the stitches that are currently on the needle are going to become that last row of knitting. So if I want 6 rows of seed stitch, when I'm finished, I have to work my bind off row while I'm working my final row of seed stitch. So I begin by working my the first 2 like I would normally, and then I start binding off. So as these stitches come off the needle, they become the final row under the needle, and then the new stitches that are on the needle are going to become the bind off chain. So that stitch I just worked was a knit, and we can see the knit right below the needle. The purl bump from the previous row is right below it. Now I'm working a purl stitch. So you can see that purl bump below the needle, and now I'm going to create the bind off chain with the stitches that are on the needle. So you can see I have my final purl bump there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got my 6 rows of seed stitch. I've got my bind off chain. I've got my cast on edge. I've got 6 rows of ribbing and 6 rows of stockinette in between. So what we've learned here is that the cast on edge can affect how many rows that you have in pattern. So if you work 6 rows in pattern, you may end up with 6 rows under your needles, or you may end up with only 5 depending on the cast on edge you've chosen. So if you want to have 6 rows of ribbing, you need to count the rows of actual stitches that are below the needles. When you're working a center part, as soon as you start working that stitch pattern, the stitches that come off the left needle are going to become that new stitch pattern. And when you have as many rows as you need below the needle, then you can go on to the next step. When you are working a section prior to a bind off, you need to count how many you have below the needle. And when you have 1 fewer than what you actually want, then you work your bind off, because your bind off is going to create that final row of knitting. So what about color? Well, here's an example of, I have some blue yarn that I used to do some ribbing, and then I switched to some green. So how many rows of green do we have? With color, we do have to take into account the stitches that are on the needle. So we can see I have 3 rows of stitches in green that are below the needle, but I also have green loops on the needle. So I will, if what I want is 4 rows of green, then I'm ready to switch to a new color. So with color, you do take into account what's currently on the needle, but what stitch pattern it's worked in is going to be determined based on how you work this next row. So if I want all of these green stitches to be in stockinette, then as I'm working across in this new row of blue, then I need to work the green in stockinette in order for them to come off the needle in stockinette. So now they've come off the needle, and now I have my 4 rows of green stockinette. If I want this blue section to be in some other stitch pattern, if I start working that stitch pattern now, like if I was going to do seed stitch, I started working that right now. The green stitches are getting the seed stitch pattern now, not the blue. The blues haven't become knits or purls yet. There can be some special challenges when knitting stitch patterns and colors and changing colors. And I've done a separate video on that I'll link to at the top of the video. As I often mention, it's useful to practice these techniques in a swatch so that you can see how the cast on you choose can make a difference in the number of rows you end up with, as well as how the bind off produces that final row of fabric. It's also useful to understand how changing to a new color is a separate matter from changing stitch patterns in terms of which row of stitches it affects. Now, sometimes a pattern will specify working an exact number of rows of a specific stitch pattern right after the cast on as a setup for the main body of the project. You might decide that because of the cast on method you have chosen, you want to work one row more or one row fewer than specified. But there are times when it's not possible to add or eliminate a row and get the result that you were looking for. In a situation like that, I will either choose a different cast on or a modified version of my cast on in order to get that desired result. I will be discussing this option in more depth in this week's Casual Friday podcast, and once that video is uploaded, I'll link to it up here. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.